When Sarah first heard about the infamous Annabelle doll, she dismissed it as just another creepy urban legend, a story to spook children and horror enthusiasts. But that all changed when she encountered something she could never explain. It was the summer of 2019, and Sarah, along with her friends, decided to take a road trip through New England. Being horror movie fans, they made it a point to visit places known for their paranormal activity. The highlight of their trip was supposed to be a visit to the Occult Museum in Monroe, Connecticut, the home of the real Annabelle doll, locked away safely behind glass. The museum itself was an eerie place, filled with cursed artifacts and objects associated with dark rituals. As they walked through the dimly lit rooms, the atmosphere grew heavier, almost suffocating. But it was the small room at the end of the tour that caught everyone's attention, the room where Annabelle was kept. The doll sat in a wooden case, her faded face frozen in an innocent yet unsettling smile. Despite the barrier between them, Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that the doll's eyes were following her, watching her every move. The tour guide's warnings echoed in her mind. Do not touch the glass, and never, under any circumstances, taunt Annabelle. Sarah didn't believe in ghosts or cursed dolls, so when her friends dared her to take a photo of Annabelle, she didn't hesitate. She raised her phone and snapped a picture, feeling a strange, icy sensation wash over her as she did. It was as if the room had suddenly dropped several degrees. Later that night, the group checked into a nearby motel. They were still buzzing with excitement from their visit, sharing the photos they had taken. But when Sarah looked at the picture of Annabelle on her phone, her blood ran cold. The doll's eyes, which had been looking straight ahead in the museum, were now staring directly at her. And behind the glass, faintly visible, was a shadowy figure, a face twisted and distorted, peering out from the darkness. Sarah tried to brush it off as a trick of the light or a glitch in the camera, but deep down, she felt a growing sense of unease. She decided to delete the photo, but when she opened her gallery, the image wouldn't go away. Every time she tried to remove it, it would reappear, even more distorted than before. That night, Sarah was plagued by nightmares. She dreamed of Annabelle, but the doll wasn't in her glass case. It was in her motel room, sitting at the foot of her bed, its head slowly turning toward her. She tried to scream, but no sound came out. The doll's eyes seemed to glow in the dark, and as it began to move closer, Sarah jolted awake, drenched in sweat. The next morning, she told her friends about the dream, but they laughed it off, teasing her for letting a doll get into her head. But the sense of dread didn't leave her. As they packed up to continue their trip, strange things began to happen. Objects in their room were moved. Doors that had been closed were found ajar, and the cold spots Sarah had felt in the museum seemed to follow her everywhere. The final straw came when they stopped for lunch at a roadside diner. Sarah excused herself to go to the restroom, but as she was washing her hands, the lights flickered, and she heard a faint whisper. Her name, spoken in a voice that wasn't her own. She looked up at the mirror and saw, standing behind her, the shadowy figure from the photo. Its hand was resting on her shoulder, and in its other hand, it held the Annabelle doll. Sarah screamed and bolted out of the restroom, her heart pounding in her chest. She knew she had to get rid of the cursed photo, but no matter what she did, it kept appearing on her phone. Desperate, she threw her phone out the window of the car as they drove, hoping to rid herself of the curse. But the terror didn't end there. That night, as they stayed at another motel, Sarah awoke to the sound of soft, childlike laughter. She sat up, her heart racing, and saw, standing in the corner of the room, the Annabelle Doll. It was out of its glass case, its head tilted slightly to the side, as if it were contemplating her. The doll's eyes seemed to gleam with malice, and as Sarah stared, frozen in fear, the doll took a step forward, then another, and another. It was moving toward her, slowly but deliberately, and with each step, the air grew colder, the room darker. Sarah scrambled out of bed and ran for the door, but the handle wouldn't turn. She pounded on the wood, screaming for help, but her voice was swallowed by the oppressive silence that filled the room. The doll was closer now, its face twisted into a grotesque smile. Just as the doll reached out to touch her, the door flew open, and her friends rushed in, turning on the lights. The doll was gone, the room empty save for the lingering cold and the unmistakable sense of being watched. Terrified and exhausted, Sarah insisted they leave immediately. They drove through the night, not stopping until they were miles away from that cursed place. But even then, the fear didn't leave her. Every shadow, every creak of the floorboards made her jump, and the sense of being watched never truly went away. In the days that followed, Sarah tried to forget what had happened, but the memory of Annabelle and the shadowy figure haunted her. She swore she could still hear the faint sound of childlike laughter at night, and sometimes, when she closed her eyes, she saw the doll, her twisted smile forever burned into her mind. To this day, Sarah refuses to talk about what happened, and she never went back to that part of the country. But she knows deep down that the encounter with Annabelle was real, and she will never forget the terror that doll brought into her life. When Jacob and his fiancée Lisa moved into their new apartment, they were thrilled to start their life together. The place was small but cozy, perfect for the two of them. On their first night in the new home, they were unpacking when Lisa found an old, dusty box in the back of a closet. It was strange. Neither of them remembered packing it, and it didn't look like something that belonged to either of them. Curious, they opened the box and found a vintage Raggedy Ann doll inside. It was old and worn, with faded red yarn hair and button eyes that had seen better days. Lisa found it charming, in a creepy sort of way, and decided to keep it as a quirky decoration. She placed it on a shelf in their living room, right next to some framed photos of the two of them. That night, as they settled into bed, Jacob had a strange, uneasy feeling. The apartment was silent, too silent, and the air felt thick with something he couldn't quite identify. He shrugged it off, blaming it on first night jitters, and drifted off to sleep. But as the clock struck midnight, Jacob was awakened by a soft rustling noise. He sat up, listening carefully, and heard it again, like fabric being dragged across the floor. His heart started to pound in his chest as he got out of bed and quietly walked to the living room. There, in the dim light of the moon filtering through the curtains, he saw the doll. It was no longer sitting on the shelf. It was lying on the floor, its head turned to face him, the button eyes glinting in the darkness. Jacob's blood ran cold. He was certain Lisa had placed it on the shelf, and there was no way it could have fallen off by itself. Trying to calm his nerves, he picked the doll up and placed it back on the shelf. He told himself it must have just fallen and returned to bed, though sleep didn't come easily. The next morning, Jacob mentioned the incident to Lisa, but she brushed it off as his imagination. But over the next few nights, the disturbances continued. The doll never stayed where they left it. Sometimes it would be found on the couch, other times on the dining table, and once it was even found sitting in a chair, facing the bed. Lisa, too, began to feel uneasy. The apartment felt different, colder somehow, and she often caught herself glancing at the doll, half expecting it to move. But the real terror began a week later, when they decided to put the doll back in the box and hide it away in the closet. That night, as they tried to sleep, the temperature in the apartment dropped suddenly. They could see their breath in the air, and the lights flickered ominously. A soft, childlike giggle echoed through the rooms, chilling them to the bone. Jacob bolted upright, his heart hammering in his chest. He reached for Lisa, but she wasn't beside him. Panicking, he jumped out of bed and frantically searched the apartment. He found her in the living room, standing in front of the shelf where the doll used to sit. The doll was back, sitting on the shelf as if it had never been moved. But something was wrong with Lisa. She stood motionless, staring at the doll with wide, unblinking eyes, her face pale and expressionless. "Lisa?" Jacob whispered, his voice trembling. She didn't respond. She didn't even seem to hear him. Her eyes were locked on the doll, and a tear slowly rolled down her cheek. Jacob reached out to touch her, but as soon as his hand brushed her shoulder, she collapsed to the floor, unconscious. He scooped her up and rushed her to the bedroom, laying her down and checking for any signs of injury. She was breathing, but she wouldn't wake up, no matter how much he shook her or called her name. Desperate, Jacob called an ambulance. The paramedics arrived quickly, but they couldn't explain what was wrong with Lisa. Her vital signs were normal, but she was unresponsive, as if she were trapped in some sort of waking nightmare. Jacob stayed by her side all night, unable to sleep, his mind racing with fear and confusion. He couldn't stop thinking about the doll. It had to be the cause, he knew it. The next morning, as soon as the sun rose, he decided to get rid of it for good. He took the doll, placed it back in the box, and drove to the nearest dumpster, tossing it inside with a sense of finality. He hoped that would be the end of it, that whatever curse or spirit was attached to the doll would leave them alone. But when he returned home, he was met with a horrifying sight. The apartment was in shambles, furniture overturned, pictures smashed on the floor, and worst of all, the doll was sitting in the middle of the living room, its head turned toward the door as if it had been waiting for him. Jacob's blood ran cold. He backed away, but the door slammed shut behind him with a deafening bang. The temperature plummeted again, and the soft giggle echoed through the apartment, this time louder, more menacing. The doll's head slowly turned to face him, and for the first time Jacob noticed something he hadn't before. Its button eyes were gone, replaced by dark, empty sockets. The air grew thick with an oppressive, malevolent presence, and Jacob could feel it closing in on him. Suddenly, Lisa's voice echoed from the bedroom, but it wasn't her usual voice. It was twisted, distorted, as if someone else was speaking through her. "Jacob, help me." He ran to the bedroom, finding Lisa sitting upright in bed, her eyes wide open and her face twisted in a grotesque grin. Her hands were clutching the sheets so tightly that her knuckles were white, and her voice was no longer her own. "You shouldn't have tried to get rid of her, Jacob," she hissed. "Now she's angry." The lights flickered, and the room filled with the sound of footsteps, small, soft, like a child's. Jacob turned to see the doll standing in the doorway, its head cocked to the side, as if watching them with sinister curiosity. The oppressive presence grew stronger, and Jacob felt his vision blurring, his mind slipping away. The doll was closer now, its tiny hands reaching out toward him, and the last thing he heard before everything went black was that childlike giggle echoing through the darkness. When Jacob woke up, he was lying on the floor of the living room, the morning light filtering through the windows. Lisa was gone, and so was the doll. The apartment was eerily quiet. as if nothing had happened. But as he stood up, his head pounding, he noticed something that made his blood turn to ice. On the wall, written in what looked like blood, were the words, "You can't escape her." Jacob's heart raced as he frantically searched the apartment, but Lisa was nowhere to be found. He ran outside, hoping to find her, but the street was empty, and the world seemed strangely silent, as if the entire city had fallen into some kind of eerie slumber. He was alone, completely, utterly alone, and he knew deep down that the doll wasn't finished with him. Wherever he went, whatever he did, he would never be free of her. The cursed doll had claimed another victim, and there was no escaping her wrath. Victor Thompson was an antique collector with a taste for the rare and unusual. His house was a museum of oddities, filled with items from every corner of the world, ancient masks, dusty tomes, cursed relics. If it had a history, Victor wanted it. But there was one item that had eluded him for years, an artifact whispered about among collectors, known only as the Doll of Whispers. Rumors swirled around the doll, saying it had once belonged to a notorious medium who claimed it could communicate with the dead. The doll had been passed down through generations, leaving a trail of madness and death in its wake. It was said to be the most dangerous of all cursed objects, a relic no one wanted to admit to owning. Victor had searched for years, but the doll seemed to be nothing more than a myth. That was until one stormy evening when he received an email from a fellow collector offering to sell him the very doll he had been seeking. The price was exorbitant, but Victor didn't hesitate. He wired the money immediately and awaited its arrival with eager anticipation. The package arrived 2 days later, wrapped in plain brown paper and sealed with wax. Victor's heart raced as he carefully unwrapped it, revealing a small, intricately carved wooden box. The wood was old and weathered, but the carvings were still sharp. Twisted faces, gnarled hands, and hollow eyes staring back at him. Inside the box lay the Doll of Whispers. It was smaller than he had imagined, only about a foot tall, with a porcelain face, glass eyes, and a dress made of tattered lace. Its expression was serene, almost peaceful, but something about it made Victor uneasy. He placed the doll on a shelf in his study, among his other prized possessions. That night, as he sat at his desk, admiring his collection, he heard a faint whisper, like the rustling of leaves on a quiet night. He looked around the room, but it was empty. Dismissing it as the wind, he returned to his work. But the whispering didn't stop. Over the next few days, it grew louder, more persistent, like a chorus of voices speaking just out of earshot. Victor began to feel like he was being watched, a sensation that followed him from room to room. He would catch glimpses of movement in the corners of his vision, shadows that disappeared when he turned to look. His sleep was plagued by nightmares, visions of a dark, endless forest where he was hunted by unseen forces. The doll was always there, watching him from a distance, its eyes following his every move. The whispers in the forest were the same as the ones in his home, growing louder, more insistent, until they drowned out all other sound. Victor's health began to deteriorate. He couldn't eat, couldn't sleep, and his once meticulous study fell into disarray. The whispers became voices, clear and terrifying, calling his name, accusing him of sins he had never committed. They told him to listen, to obey, to give in. Desperate, Victor tried to get rid of the doll. He locked it in the wooden box and threw it into the fireplace, but the flames wouldn't touch it. He tried to smash it with a hammer, But the doll remained intact, unscathed. The voices only grew louder, their tone more menacing, as if mocking his efforts. One night, the voices reached a fever pitch, driving Victor to the brink of madness. He ran through his house, tearing at his hair, trying to escape the relentless cacophony. The doll appeared in every room, sitting on every surface, its glass eyes shining with a malevolent light. In a fit of desperation, Victor fled his home and drove to the nearest church, clutching the wooden box in his trembling hands. He begged the priest to help him, to rid him of the cursed doll. The priest, seeing the terror in Victor's eyes, agreed to perform an exorcism. As the priest chanted prayers and sprinkled holy water on the box, the whispers turned to screams, angry, vengeful screams that shook the walls of the church. The box rattled violently in Victor's hands, and for a moment he thought it would explode. But then, as suddenly as it began, the noise stopped. The box fell silent, and the air in the church grew still. Victor opened the box, hoping to see the doll destroyed, but it was gone, vanished without a trace. The priest assured him that the doll had been banished, that he was safe. But Victor wasn't convinced. The voices were gone, but the feeling of being watched remained. He returned home, but his house felt different, colder, as if something had changed. The next morning he found the wooden box on his desk, the lid slightly ajar. Inside was a single note, written in a shaky hand. "You can never escape her." Victor knew then that the doll was not gone, only hiding, waiting for the right moment to return. And when it did, there would be no escaping the whispers,